This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. Support the channel, get exclusive TLDR videos, and an ad-free experience by signing up. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been bad news, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world too. Disruption to Ukrainian energy exports and Ukrainian food exports have pushed prices up across the globe, as well as pushing developing countries into crisis. But Putin's invasion has also been bad news for the global community for another, more subtle reason. And that's because it's further eroded the nuclear taboo that developed in the aftermath of World War II. So in this video, we're going to be explaining what the nuclear taboo actually is, how Putin's damaged it, and why this is, well, truly terrible news. Before we get into Putin and his nuclear brinkmanship, a bit of context. For most of post-World War II history, talking about nuclear weapons and making nuclear threats has been a political taboo. In the vast majority of wars, including nuclear-armed powers, those powers have refrained from even threatening to use their nukes, even in the face of defeat. Consider the case of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, or the US in Vietnam, or even Israel in the 1991 Persian Gulf War. In all of these cases, despite the ability to inflict overwhelming damage, nuclear-armed powers have, for the most part, shied away from nuclear brinkmanship, and instead relied solely on conventional warfare. In the post-World War II period, the UN also passed various resolutions urging a total ban on nuclear weapons, and much of the UN's time was spent discussing accelerated disarmament. Now, the obvious exception to this was the Cold War, and especially the early Reagan administration, which talked publicly about nuclear weapons as a way to win a nuclear war, not just as a deterrence, and even persuaded NATO to deploy nuclear-capable missiles across the European continent. Even then, though, this provoked massive anti-nuclear marches in the US, and even led to an intervention by the Catholic Church, forcing what was effectively a U-turn. That's because in 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev produced a joint statement saying that, quote, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." And a few months later, Reagan was apparently even flirting with complete disarmament, at least according to his private letters with Gorbachev. Anyway, once the Cold War was over, the taboo reasserted itself via the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the 1991 START Treaty. So, with all of this context in place, you get the point. With the exception of the Cold War, most of modern history has been shrouded by a nuclear taboo. However, in the last 20 years or so, that taboo has begun to erode, and that process has accelerated massively with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the accompanying nuclear brinkmanship that's gone along with it. Ultimately, this process probably first started under George Bush and his disdain for multilateralism. Essentially, George Bush and John Bolton, who was Bush's first Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs, before going on to be the US ambassador to the UN, weren't particularly keen on multilateral agreements, because they didn't think the US, as the world's leading superpower, really needed to make any concessions to anyone. In fact, Bolton repeatedly sabotaged US disarmament negotiations with North Korea, and as well as trying to reduce funding to the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative's Threat Reduction Program, which aims to halt the proliferation of nuclear materials. This trend was reversed by Obama, though, who made it his mission to negotiate the now-defunct JCPOA, which was the only significant and successful non-proliferation treaty of the last decade. However, things did go back again under Trump, who didn't really care about the taboo. And that's because when it comes to nuclear weapons, both in rhetoric and in policy, Trump was probably the most bellicose president in modern history. Trump famously threatened North Korea with, quote, "fire and fury like the world has never seen" in 2017, before bragging about the size of his nuclear button just a year later. Trump also unilaterally pulled out of the aforementioned INF Treaty and the 1992 Open Skies Treaty, which allows the US, Russia, and many European states to monitor each other's atomic arsenals via photographic reconnaissance flights. Trump also expanded the list of external threats that officially justify nuclear retaliation, invested in developing more low and high-yield bombs, and cancelled the Pentagon's plan to decommission the megaton-class B-83-1 gravity bomb, America's largest nuke. In fact, after doing all of this, Trump actually needed more nuclear material in order to arm all of these weapons. So Trump also tried to restart production of plutonium cores to be used in nuclear warheads. And he did this via a $9 billion budget boost for the US National Nuclear Security Agency. Now, since then, Biden has reversed some of the damage, doing things like renewing the START treaty with Russia. But it appears that some of the damage could be permanent. The INF Treaty is still dead in the water. Biden apparently doesn't want to rejoin Open Skies, and the rhetorical taboo is still hanging by a thread. Trump's bellicosity has also encouraged other states from disarming, and as such, none of the 5 big historical nuclear powers have made much progress in disarmament at all. Worse still, China has refused to sign up to any bi- or trilateral nuclear treaties. And a lack of cooperation with the international community means that aspiring nuclear states like Iran and North Korea are now closer than ever before. Anyway, you get the idea. The nuclear taboo was already in tatters before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, the subsequent nuclear threats made by Russian officials and Russian state media have put the taboo under even more strain than ever. As you've probably already noticed, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been accompanied by some extraordinarily explicit nuclear threats. On the day of the invasion itself, Putin threatened countries that were tempted to interfere with consequences, quote, such as you have never seen in your entire history. Then, just a few days later, he raised Russia's nuclear readiness level in another thinly veiled threat aimed at NATO and the West. Russian state media has actually been even more hawkish, though. Beginning in late April, state media has regularly discussed nuking so-called unfriendly countries, most notably the UK and US. Now, we should say that this isn't entirely new. In the late 2010s, Putin escalated his nuclear rhetoric to match Trump, with him occasionally bragging about Russian nuclear capabilities as well as threatening NATO. Nonetheless, the rhetoric over the last few months has been more explicit and more regular than ever before. And that's bad news for basically anyone who doesn't want a nuclear war, because once the taboo is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild. And explicit nuclear threats massively increase the chances of an actual nuclear detonation. So what can the rest of the world actually do about it? Well, if the international community wants to preserve this taboo, there should be widespread criticism of Putin's nuclear brinkmanship. While Biden has done well in not rising to Putin's threats, he has U-turned on his campaign pledge to scrap Trump's first-use policy. And when it comes to the rest of the international community's reaction, it's just been too muted, especially countries like China, who ordinarily spend a lot of time criticizing the US military, but have been pretty quiet about Putin's actions. This is in part because these things are just hard to think about, but also because there's just little political incentive to actually do so. Talking sensibly about nuclear risk is often perceived as weak by the electorate, who don't like seeing their money, quote-unquote, wasted on hypothetical catastrophes. Obviously, most of the time, that's kind of fine, because catastrophes are fortunately rare. But when a nuclear war suddenly looks like a real possibility, all of these collapsed treaties, which barely hit the headlines when they happened, suddenly begin looking like real mistakes. That doesn't mean that things can't de-escalate, though. One notable exception to all of this is South Africa, who actually totally shut down their nuclear program in the 90s. But how did they do it? And did they lose their global influence as a result of doing so? Well, we discuss exactly that in our latest Nebula exclusive video. We actually have a whole bunch of exclusive content over there too, including 2 other new videos that we put out this week alone. That's our interview with TechAlter about the EU's new USB-C laws, and an argument with the TLDR UK team about who Britain's next Prime Minister will end up being. And it's not just us on Nebula either. And that's because we built the platform with a ton of other incredible educational creators, including these people and many more. So when you do sign up, you'll get tons from TLDR and all the others, as well as all of our videos ad-free. If you're interested and do want to sign up, then you'll want to use the link in the description to get the Nebula Curiosity Stream bundle deal. Here's how it works. If you sign up to Curiosity Stream, home to the best documentaries online, then you'll also get Nebula included absolutely free. That means it's less than $15 a year for both services. Curiosity Stream for high quality documentaries, and Nebula for bonus TLDR content. And doing so also really supports the channel, so thanks for your help.